Everyone knows the image: stone towers rising against a grey sky, walls 3 meters thick, impenetrable, eternal. A lord seated at the high table while the countryside stretches beneath him, obedient, productive, endlessly paying. The castle as the ultimate symbol of wealth, dominance, permanence, the kind of power that doesn't ask for anything. It just has. Here is the version they gave you in school. The medieval noble built a castle, collected rents from the peasants below, raised knights to fight his wars, and spent generations accumulating power behind walls that nothing could breach. The stone was the wealth, the walls were the business, the castle was the money. That version is almost completely wrong. Not wrong in its atmosphere, not wrong in the broad strokes of feudalism. Wrong in the most important way anything can be wrong. Wrong about who was paying whom. Because if you actually follow the money, if you stop looking at the towers and start reading the ledgers, what you find is something that doesn't match the legend at all. What you find is that for the vast majority of noble families across medieval Europe, a castle was not a money-making machine. It was not a vault. It was not a seat of passive wealth compounding behind impenetrable walls. It was a financial trap. A magnificent, politically necessary, socially indispensable financial trap, but a trap nonetheless. One that consumed fortunes, buried families in debt, and destroyed dynasties that had survived wars, famines, and plague, only to go quietly bankrupt behind the very walls they had spent generations building. And here is what makes this genuinely interesting. This was not a secret. The people living inside these castles knew what they cost. The accounts were kept. The ledgers survived. The receipts exist in archives across England, France, Wales, and Germany. And they tell a story that the romantic version of medieval history has been carefully avoiding for centuries. So let's stop avoiding it. The myth goes like this. A castle is a source of power and wealth simultaneously. You build the walls, you project dominance, and the money flows in. The reality is something quite different. A castle, stripped of everything surrounding it, no villages, no farmland, no mills, no roads, no rivers, was worth, in the precise economic language of the people who built them, less than nothing. It was a liability. A stone structure sitting in empty fields didn't generate income, it consumed it. Every day the garrison needed feeding. Every winter the walls needed maintenance. Every year the roof needed repair, the stables needed horses, the staff needed paying. And unlike almost any other form of wealth in the medieval world, the costs of a castle never stopped, never slowed, never gave you a season off. Rain, snow, siege, plague, famine, the castle kept consuming regardless of what the outside world was doing to your income. The structure that was supposed to protect your wealth was, paradoxically, one of the most reliable mechanisms for destroying it. The first clue that something is wrong with the standard story is a number. One single number that, once you've heard it, makes the entire romantic picture of castle ownership start to crack. Caernarfon Castle, North Wales, 1283. King Edward I of England, the richest man in the kingdom, commanding the full tax revenue of a medieval nation-state, began construction on what would become one of the most formidable fortresses in Europe. He needed it. He had just conquered Wales, and he needed to hold it. The castle was strategic, political, militarily essential. The construction ran for nearly 50 years. The final cost, somewhere between £20,000 and £25,000 in medieval money. Historians today estimate that translates to approximately $23.5 million in modern purchasing power. For one castle. And Edward wasn't building one castle. He was running an entire construction campaign across Wales simultaneously. Conwy Castle at roughly £15,000, Harlech at around £10,000. Beaumaris begun in 1295 and still unfinished by the 1320s, having already consumed another £15,000 before the money simply ran out. His total Welsh building campaign between 1277 and 1304 cost approximately £80,000. That £80,000 construction bill, the richest king in England, building with the tax revenues of an entire kingdom behind him, contributed directly to the financial crisis that overwhelmed his government in the late 1290s. If the wealthiest man in England could build himself into a fiscal crisis, what do you think was happening to ordinary noble families trying to maintain even a modest stone keep on the income of a few dozen villages. But here is where the story gets genuinely strange. Because the construction cost, the staggering, multi-decade, kingdom-straining cost of actually building the castle, was not the main problem. It was just the entry fee. At Caernarfon, we have extraordinarily precise records from the years 1285 and 1286. Records that survive in archives and have been analysed by historians in granular detail. And those records reveal something that seems almost impossible until you understand the medieval economy. In those years, the raw cost of purchasing all the building materials, the limestone, the structural timber, the iron, the lead for roofing, the lime mortar, came to £151. The cost of transporting those same materials to the building site came to £535. Read that again slowly. For every single pound spent buying the materials, the builder spent an additional £3.54 just getting them there. The transportation cost was more than 3.5 times the material cost. Why? Because medieval transportation was not the efficient, invisible logistics network we live inside today. Moving heavy stone by land meant ox carts on unpaved, frequently impassable roads. Slow, expensive, prone to breakdown, and brutally inefficient for heavy loads. The only way to move large quantities of building material at any reasonable cost was by water, river barge or coastal ship. This is why, if you look at a map of where major medieval castles were actually built, the pattern is not random. It is not purely about defensive high ground. It is, overwhelmingly, about water access. Castles cluster along rivers and coastlines not primarily because of the strategic view, because water access was what made the construction remotely affordable. Location was a financial decision before it was a military one. And at the peak of Caernarfon's construction in February 1296, we have records showing that the master mason responsible for designing most of Edward's Welsh castles, a man named James of St. George, submitted a formal request for £250 per week just to cover wages. 400 masons, 200 quarrymen, 30 smiths, 3,000 additional labourers, £250 per week for one construction project. Here is the part that almost never appears in the popular history. Keeping 3,000 workers on a building site for months required feeding them continuously. Bread, ale, salted meat, fish, dried vegetables, a constant supply chain just to keep the workforce alive and functional. At Beaumaris in the summer of 1295, records show approximately 3,500 workers employed on the site. The local agricultural economy of the island of Anglesey could not produce enough food to supply them. Grain and cured fish had to be imported by ship from other parts of England. The food bill during major construction projects often exceeded the cost of the raw materials themselves. You think you're paying for a building. You are actually paying for a small temporary city that happens to produce a building at the end of it. And then the building finishes, and the real costs begin. This is the moment where the myth and the reality diverge most sharply. Because in the popular imagination, the completion of the castle is the end of the financial story. The walls are up, the investment is made. Now the returns flow in. In economic reality, the completion of the castle was the moment the owner stepped onto a financial treadmill that would run for the rest of his life and the lives of his descendants. A completed castle of any political significance required a permanent household staff just to function at the most basic level. The World History Encyclopedia, drawing from medieval household records, notes that a large castle would have a household staff of at least 50 people. Not 50 people during a feast, 50 people minimum, year-round, regardless of whether the lord was even in residence. 50 people to be fed, housed, clothed and paid, every single day, every single year. And 50 was the floor, a major regional stronghold, the kind that actually mattered politically. The kind that justified the construction cost, could house and employ hundreds. The castle steward, functioning as the chief executive officer of the entire operation, managing accounts, legal matters, and estate administration. The marshal overseeing the stables and military household. The chaplain handling religious services and correspondence. One of the few literate people in the building, and therefore indispensable. The butler managing the wine cellar and formal service. The constable responsible for the garrison and the fabric of the building itself. These were not servants. These were senior professionals, and they commanded salaries to match. So we arrive at the fundamental question that the romantic version of castle history never actually asks. If the construction was this expensive, and the ongoing costs were this relentless, and the staff costs were this fixed, what was actually coming in? And the answer is more complicated, more precarious, and more revealing than anything in the legend. Because the income of a medieval castle was not the castle. It was everything around it. If you want to understand the economics of a medieval castle, forget the towers. Forget the battlements. Forget the great hall and the banners and the knights in the courtyard. Start with the grain. Because the single most important financial document in any medieval noble's life was not his title deed. It was not his military commission. It was not the charter that gave him the right to hold a castle in the first place. It was the annual agricultural survey of his estate, the accounting of how much land was under cultivation, how many tenant farmers were paying rent, how many mills were processing grain, how many rivers were yielding fish, and how many roads were carrying merchants who could be taxed for the privilege of passing through his territory. That document determined everything. Whether the family ate well or borrowed, whether the garrison got paid or mutinied, whether the castle stood for another generation or got quietly sold off to cover debts that had been compounding in the background for years. And that document had almost nothing to do with the castle itself. Here is the core financial reality of medieval castle ownership, and it is one that almost nobody states plainly. A castle on its own generated virtually no income. Less than virtually none, actually. A fortress sitting in the middle of empty fields, no villages, no productive farmland, no watermills, no navigable river, no road carrying merchant traffic, was not a seat of power. It was an extremely expensive stone box that bled money every single day without return. The wealth was never in the walls. The wealth was in the system surrounding them. Under the feudal structure that governed England, France, and most of Western Europe throughout the medieval period, the true economic foundation of any lord was his manor, the organized network of productive assets radiating outward from the castle in every direction. Tenant villages paying rent, arable fields producing grain, managed forests yielding timber and hunting rights, functioning watermills charging a processing fee on every sack of grain they ground, rivers running fish, roads carrying commerce. Every element of that network generated income. The castle at the center generated almost none. Think of it in purely modern commercial terms, because the analogy is almost perfect. The castle was the corporate headquarters. The manor system was the revenue-generating business. And just like any corporate headquarters, the castle consumed capital continuously while producing nothing directly. The value it added was organizational, administrative, legal, and military. It made the income from everything else possible, by providing the credible threat of force that kept tenants paying, merchants moving, and rivals at a respectful distance. But take away the revenue-generating assets surrounding it, and the headquarters is just an enormous, ruinously expensive building, consuming resources with no output to justify the cost. Agricultural rent was the baseline. Tenant farmers working land that technically belonged to the lord paid rent, either in cash or in kind. A portion of their harvest delivered directly to the castle's stores. On top of rent came labor obligations. Tenants were frequently required to provide a certain number of days of work per year on the lord's own directly managed farmland. This was, in purely economic terms, a form of unpaid labor tax imposed on top of the cash or crop rent already being paid. Then came the mills. Under the system that dominated most of Western Europe, tenants were legally required to grind their grain at the lord's mill. They were prohibited from using hand mills or traveling to a competitor. The miller charged a fee, typically a percentage of the grain being processed, for every sack that went through the mechanism. For a castle estate with multiple working watermills and a large agricultural base, mill income could be substantial and remarkably consistent. People need to eat regardless of the political weather. The manorial court added another revenue stream. Every dispute between tenants, every inheritance, every marriage, every fine for straying livestock or timber cutting or boundary violation, all of it flowed through the lord's court and generated fees. When a tenant died, his family paid an inheritance fee called a heriot. typically the family's best animal or its cash equivalent, just to retain the right to keep farming the same land their father had farmed. Marriage required the lord's formal permission, and that permission carried a price. The court was not just governance, it was, run efficiently, a reliable and consistent income stream. But here is the factor that truly separated the comfortable castle owners from the genuinely powerful ones. The variable that could multiply income beyond what any amount of agricultural rent could deliver. Location. Specifically, proximity to trade. A castle sitting beside a major road, a navigable river, or a key bridge had access to something that fields and mills simply could not match: the continuous flow of commerce. Every merchant convoy moving goods overland was a taxable event the moment it entered the lord's territory. Every boat moving cargo down a river owed a toll at every castle positioned along the bank. Every traveller crossing a bridge paid a fee. By the late 14th century, the Rhine River in what is now Germany had 62 licensed toll collection stations between the city of Mainz and the Dutch border. 62 separate castles, towers, and fortified positions, each extracting a fee from every boat that passed. Some of these castles were constructed on islands placed directly in the middle of the river, specifically so that chains could be stretched across the water to physically stop passing ships and demand payment before allowing them to continue. This was not incidental, this was the entire point. The castle wasn't guarding the river, the castle was the toll booth, and the river was the highway. In England, lords who held charters for bridges collected what was formerly called pontage, a toll designated for bridge maintenance and defence, but which in practice was simply a tax on movement. The rates were precisely calibrated. A loaded wagon paid more than a rider on horseback. A rider paid more than a man walking with a pack animal. The financial conclusion that medieval lords understood intuitively, and that the records confirm explicitly, is this: a castle positioned on a trade route was worth 10 times more than an identical castle sitting in the centre of good farmland. Not because of the stone, because of what flowed past it. Now the costs sitting on the other side of this ledger. Because the income picture, however robust in the best locations, was always being eaten by a set of expenses that were fixed, relentless, and structurally impossible to reduce below a certain floor. The permanent household staff alone represented a massive fixed cost. 50 people at minimum, hundreds at major strongholds, all requiring food, housing, clothing, and regular payment, regardless of what the agricultural yield had been that year, or whether the lord happened to be in residence. The garrison itself was a separate line item entirely. Knights and mounted men-at-arms were the most expensive military personnel in the medieval world. A knight required multiple horses for different functions: a destrier for combat, a palfrey for travel, a rouncey for general use, each animal requiring feed, stabling, veterinary attention, and replacement when it inevitably broke down. And the physical structure itself never stopped requiring money. Medieval building materials degraded continuously and rapidly without active maintenance. Lime mortar cracked and required repointing. Lead roofing moved and leaked. Timber components rotted and needed replacement. Iron fittings corroded. Ignore maintenance for a few years, and a medieval castle didn't gradually deteriorate. It deteriorated rapidly because each problem that went unaddressed created structural weaknesses that accelerated every adjacent problem. Here is where the financial structure of castle economics becomes genuinely precarious. The income was variable, the expenses were fixed. Agricultural rent depended on harvests. Harvests depended on weather. Medieval weather was not the stable, predictable climate system that modern agricultural planning assumes. It was volatile, regional, and capable of catastrophic failure without warning. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 struck England, France, and much of northern Europe with a series of harvest failures caused by an extended period of cold, wet weather. Successive crop failures across multiple years. Grain prices spiked to levels that made normal provisioning impossible. Livestock died from disease. This is where the Italian banking families enter the story. The Bardi and Peruzzi families of Florence, two of the largest and most sophisticated banking houses in 14th century Europe, with branches across England, France, and the major commercial cities of the continent, became the primary lenders to European nobility. When a bad harvest wiped out a year's agricultural income, the lord borrowed from the Florentines to bridge the gap, promising repayment when the next harvest came in. When war started, and in the 14th century, between England and France, war was essentially permanent during the Hundred Years' War running from 1337 to 1453. Those borrowed funds got redirected toward military costs instead of debt repayment. The loan rolled over. Interest compounded. New loans were taken to service old ones. The mechanism was identical to a modern debt spiral. And then Edward III of England defaulted in 1345 on loans of 900,000 gold florins to the Bardi family and 600,000 florins to the Peruzzi family. 1.5 million gold florins. Gone. Both banking houses collapsed. The debts of one king destroyed two of the largest financial institutions in Europe. For smaller noble families, the mechanism was the same, just scaled down to the domestic level. A few consecutive bad harvests, one expensive military campaign, one royal visit that had to be funded at enormous expense on borrowed money. And suddenly, the family was mortgaged. The next generation didn't inherit the castle, they inherited the debt attached to it. History loves to present financial catastrophe as weather. It arrived. It was terrible. It passed. Nobody caused it. It simply occurred, the way storms occur, the way floods arrive without authorship. The castle fell into debt. The family went bankrupt. The dynasty ended. These things happen. This framing is extraordinarily convenient for the people who made the decisions that caused the catastrophe. And in the economics of medieval castle ownership, the decisions that converted manageable financial pressure into dynasty-ending collapse were almost never random. They were made by specific people, in specific rooms, with specific interests that had very little to do with the welfare of the institution, or the people they were nominally responsible for protecting. Follow the decisions. That's where this part of the story lives. The most financially dangerous moment in a castle owner's life was not a bad harvest. Bad harvests were recoverable, given time and credit. The most dangerous moment was when the king came calling, and kings came calling constantly. The mechanism was called scutage in England, a tax levied on knights' fees in lieu of actual military service. In theory, it was a commutation payment. In practice, it was a variable tax that could be levied at the king's discretion, at rates that fluctuated based on how badly the king needed money at that particular moment. In 1211, King John of England levied scutage at the rate of 3 marks per knight's fee, and then, within 2 years, levied it again, and again. By 1214, John had levied scutage 11 times in 16 years, 11 separate tax demands on the same asset base in less than 2 decades. The barons did not simply accept this. Their resistance culminated in 1215 in a confrontation at Runnymede that produced Magna Carta, a document that is remembered today primarily as a constitutional milestone. That framing is accurate. It is also incomplete. Magna Carta was, at its economic core, a debt restructuring negotiation conducted at sword point. Clause after clause addressed specific financial grievances, limits on the king's ability to levy arbitrary scutage without baronial consent, restrictions on the crown's ability to seize assets for unpaid debts without due process. The barons were not primarily making a philosophical argument about the nature of kingship. They were making a financial argument about the sustainability of a tax burden that was destroying the economic foundations of their estates. The politics was the surface. The money was the mechanism. Now here is where the hidden players enter. The Italian banking families. The Bardi family established their English operations in the late 13th century. By the 1320s, they were not simply bankers to the English crown. They were the tax farmers for significant portions of English crown revenue, meaning they had purchased the right to collect customs duties and other royal revenues in advance, in exchange for a lump sum payment to the crown, and then recouped their investment by actually collecting the taxes over time. Think about what this means in practice. The king needed cash now before the taxes were collected. The Bardi provided cash now in exchange for the right to collect the revenue later, keeping the difference as profit. The king got immediate liquidity. The Bardi got a guaranteed revenue stream secured by the taxing authority of the English state. This arrangement made the Bardi and subsequently the Peruzzi not just creditors of the English crown, but participants in the actual machinery of royal finance. They weren't waiting outside the door hoping to be repaid. They were inside the system, with access to information about royal revenues, expenditures, and financial vulnerabilities that no external observer could match. When Edward III launched his military campaign against France in the late 1330s, he needed money at a scale that his normal revenue could not supply. The Bardi and Peruzzi were the only institutions in Europe capable of providing credit at that scale quickly enough to matter militarily. Edward needed them. They knew he needed them. The terms reflected that asymmetry. The loans accumulated, the campaigns continued. The revenue that was supposed to service the debt kept getting redirected toward military expenses instead. And when Edward defaulted in 1345, historians examining the records suggest that both banking houses had been aware of the deteriorating situation for years. The question is why they kept lending. The answer, records indicate, was that stopping would have been worse than continuing. A complete withdrawal of credit from the English crown would have ended the relationship entirely and triggered an immediate default anyway, while also destroying the value of the existing loan portfolio. They were trapped by the size of their own exposure. The decision to keep extending credit to Edward III was made by men who understood the risks perfectly and concluded that the alternative was worse. It was a rational calculation that led to catastrophic outcomes for both institutions. Two of the largest banks in Europe destroyed not by ignorance, but by the logic of their own position. In 1242, King Henry III of England raised a large army to campaign in France. That single campaign, 1 year, one military venture, cost £40,000. Historians assessing that figure note that it represented roughly the entire normal annual income of the English crown in that period. One campaign, 1 year, the full annual revenue of a kingdom spent. And there was something even worse than the financial cost of the campaign itself. To deny besieging forces the ability to use cover while approaching the walls, defenders routinely made a tactical decision that was militarily rational and financially catastrophic. They burned their own surrounding settlements. The villages, mills, orchards, and farmsteads in the immediate vicinity of the castle, the productive agricultural base that generated the income making the castle economically viable, were systematically destroyed by the castle's own defenders to deny them to the enemy. The siege ended, the castle stood, the income-generating infrastructure that had been funding it for generations was ash. Rebuilding it took years. During those years, the fixed costs of the castle kept running, while the variable income was gone. There is a particular kind of historical cruelty that operates in plain sight without ever being named. It doesn't announce itself as injustice, it arrives as arithmetic, as the cold, neutral language of accounts receivable and accounts payable, of harvests weighed and rents due, and debts compounding at rates that the people paying them were never fully equipped to understand or contest. The financial decisions made at the top of the medieval hierarchy, in royal councils, in Florentine banking houses, in the war councils where campaigns were planned and military levies were calculated, did not stay at the top. They moved downward, through the noble families trying to maintain their castles on shrinking margins, through the tenant farmers who absorbed the cost every time their lord needed to extract more to service his own obligations. The castle was the focal point of this downward pressure. It was where the financial decisions of the powerful became the lived reality of everyone else. Under the manorial system, a tenant farmer's obligations to his lord were not simply a matter of paying rent and going about his life. They were a layered system of extractions, each individually defensible as customary or administrative, collectively representing a claim on a significant portion of everything the tenant produced. Base rent came first. Then labor obligations, days per year when the tenant was required to work the lord's own land at zero cost to the lord. Then mill fees, the mandatory processing charge from which the tenant had no legal recourse to opt out. Then the heriot. When a tenant died, his family paid an inheritance fee just to retain the right to keep farming the same land their father had farmed. The moment of a family's maximum vulnerability was also the moment of maximum financial extraction. Marriage required the lord's permission. That permission carried a fee called merchet. A daughter's wedding was, within the manorial system, a taxable transaction. This was not corruption in the modern sense. It was the system functioning as designed. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 is the clearest case study of what happened when that system came under pressure. Beginning in the spring of 1315, a prolonged period of cold, wet weather across northern Europe produced a series of harvest failures of a severity that the agricultural system of the time was simply not equipped to absorb. Grain prices across England roughly tripled compared to the preceding decade's averages. By 1316, conditions had worsened further. Animals died from disease. The agricultural income base of the English nobility evaporated. For the tenant, the calculus was darker still. In a period of sharply rising food prices, a family that in an average year operated with a thin margin between subsistence and crisis now found itself below that line. And the Lord's financial obligations did not pause because the harvest had failed. The rent was still due. The mill fee was still charged. The labor days were still required. Estimates of mortality from the Great Famine across northern Europe range from 10 to 25% of the population in the worst affected areas. That mortality was not evenly distributed. It concentrated among the people with the least margin: the tenant farmers, the landless laborers, the families already operating at subsistence. The castle protected the people inside it. The cost of that protection was borne, in very large measure, by the people outside it. The Hundred Years' War, running from 1337 to 1453, produced the same dynamic at continental scale. Military campaigns in the medieval period did not primarily damage armies. They primarily damaged the agricultural landscapes through which armies moved. The standard tactical approach, the chevauchée, the mounted raid, was specifically designed to destroy the economic base of the enemy's territory. Crops were burned. Livestock were taken or slaughtered. Mills were demolished. Villages were burned. Orchards were cut down. The goal was not primarily to kill enemy soldiers, it was to destroy the enemy lord's ability to fund soldiers. In 1381, the social tensions generated by decades of this financial structure exploded into what is known in English history as the Peasants' Revolt. The immediate trigger was a poll tax, a flat tax levied per head of population, regardless of income or wealth, imposed to fund ongoing military operations in France. The revolt was suppressed, the ringleaders were executed, the castles held. The financial structure that produced the revolt remained largely intact. The people who made the decisions that created the conditions for the revolt experienced it primarily as a political inconvenience, rapidly resolved by force. The people who lived through it experienced it as the end of a moment when change had briefly seemed possible, followed by a return to the same arithmetic. There is a question that serious historians almost never ask in public forums, even when the evidence makes it unavoidable. Not what happened. The records answer that well enough. Not who was responsible. The names are in the accounts. The question that doesn't get asked is this: who benefits from the version of history that replaced the documented reality? Because the romantic vision of the medieval castle, the symbol of noble order, of hierarchical stability, of a world in which the strong protected the weak in exchange for honest labor and loyal service, did not emerge spontaneously from the historical record. It was constructed, deliberately, systematically, by specific institutions with specific interests in a particular version of the past. The romantic version of the medieval castle was largely a 19th century construction. Specifically, it was a product of the Romantic movement in art and literature, and of the particular political needs of newly industrializing European states that found in the medieval past a set of symbols useful for managing the social tensions of the present. Walter Scott's novels, Ivanhoe published in 1819, The Talisman in 1825, Kenilworth in 1821, created the template for popular understanding of medieval life that persists in modified form to the present day. Scott's medieval world was one of chivalric honor, noble obligation, romantic adventure, and a hierarchical social order that functioned, however imperfectly, as a kind of organic community. That vision was politically useful, not conspiratorially useful. There is no evidence of coordinated effort to deploy Scott's novels as propaganda, but structurally useful in the way that any cultural product becomes politically functional when it serves the ideological needs of powerful institutions. The development of modern historical scholarship in the 19th century, the professionalization of history as an academic discipline, happened simultaneously with the consolidation of the modern European nation-state. And nation-states require usable pasts. A usable past is not simply a true past. It is a past that makes the present seem natural, inevitable, and legitimate. In England, the castle system was retrospectively framed as the foundation of the constitutional order, the physical infrastructure of the feudal system that produced Magna Carta, that eventually evolved into parliamentary government. The financial exploitation embedded in the manorial system did not disappear from the historical record. Scholars documented it carefully, but it was contextualized as a phase, a necessary stage in a developmental story that ended in constitutional progress. In Germany, the medieval castle became central to Romantic nationalism. The Bergen perched on Rhine cliffs were physical monuments to German historical depth. The financial reality of those Rhine toll stations, 62 separate extraction points bleeding the commercial lifeblood out of the river trade, was absorbed into the nationalist narrative as evidence of the vigor and independence of medieval German political culture. The castles became symbols precisely because symbols require the suppression of complicating details. Now put the official version and the documented reality side by side. Official version: the medieval castle was the center of feudal order, a system in which military protection was exchanged for agricultural labor, creating a stable, if hierarchical, society in which each class fulfilled its ordained function. Documented reality: the feudal system was a legally enforced extraction mechanism in which agricultural producers were required, under penalty of court sanction and potential eviction, to transfer a substantial portion of their output to a castle-owning class whose primary function was maintaining the military force required to enforce the extraction. Official version: noble families built castles as statements of power and confidence, expressions of their dynastic strength and permanence. Documented reality: noble families built castles because the feudal system required them to maintain a military establishment to enforce their rights, and because failing to do so meant losing those rights to neighbors who had maintained theirs. Many of them built castles they could not afford, funded constructions with borrowed money, and left their heirs with debt structures that took generations to resolve. Official version: the great medieval banking families provided essential credit that allowed medieval commerce and governance to function. Documented reality: the great medieval banking families created financial dependencies that transferred significant control over crown and noble finances to Florentine institutions, extracted substantial value through interest and tax farming arrangements, and ultimately created exposure that destroyed both the borrowers and themselves when the debt spiral completed its logic. The gap between those two versions is not a matter of minor interpretive disagreement. It is a structural divergence, a difference between a history that explains how power maintained itself and a history that legitimizes the institutions that power created. The historians didn't make a mistake. That is the uncomfortable conclusion that the evidence supports. The academic specialists who studied medieval estate accounts documented the financial reality accurately enough in the specialist literature, where it remained largely inaccessible to the broader public. The popular historians who wrote the versions that reached classrooms and museums made choices about emphasis, framing, and narrative selection that were not random. They chose the version that made the past legible as a story of progress. They chose the version that made the castle a symbol of civilization rather than a symbol of the cost that civilization imposed on the people who built and maintained it. And that is precisely what makes what comes next so important. Because the pattern persists, and the consequences of not recognizing it are not historical. They are immediate. Here is the thing about patterns: they don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with labels attached, identifying themselves as repetitions of something you should have recognized earlier. They come dressed in the language of the present, in the vocabulary of modern finance, contemporary politics, current events, and they rely on the assumption that the past is genuinely past. That assumption is precisely what the pattern depends on to keep functioning. So let's break it. Start with the most fundamental economic structure of the medieval castle system, stripped of its historical costume. You have a class of actors who control a physical and legal infrastructure. That infrastructure does not primarily generate wealth. It extracts wealth from the productive activity happening around it, through a system of legally enforced obligations that the productive class cannot easily refuse. The castle owner does not farm the land. He controls the conditions under which others farm it and extracts a portion of their output as the price of that permission. He does not operate the mill. He owns it, makes its use compulsory, and collects a fee from every sack of grain that passes through it. He does not build the roads. He controls them and charges tolls on every merchant and traveller who needs to use them. Now remove the stone walls and the medieval setting.
Boatman.
Apply the same
Silver.
structure to
Must you
contemporary
always make us
economic
wait?
arrangements.
Clear the chain.
Who controls the infrastructure through which economic activity must pass? Who extracts a fee from every transaction that moves through the systems they own? Who holds monopoly positions, legal, technological, geographic, that make their services compulsory rather than optional for the productive population that depends on them? The parallel is not metaphorical, it is structural. The mechanism is identical. The castle changed its shape. The economics did not. Consider the debt spiral, the specific financial sequence that destroyed medieval noble families and, through them, imposed costs on the tenant populations below them. Fixed costs running continuously, regardless of revenue conditions. Variable income subject to disruption by forces outside the owner's control. A gap emerging between costs and revenue. Short-term borrowing to bridge the gap. Circumstances preventing repayment. Loans rolling over. Interest compounding. New debt taken to service old debt. In 2008, the largest financial institutions in the United States and Europe collapsed, or came close enough to collapse that their survival required intervention at a scale that no medieval banking house could have imagined, through a mechanism that any student of the Bardi and Peruzzi would have recognized immediately. The medieval answer to the question of who absorbed the loss was the tenant farmers, through increased extraction, reduced protections, and the transfer of debt downward through the feudal hierarchy. The modern answer in 2008 was the tax-paying public, through government bailouts that socialized the losses of institutions whose profits had been privatized during the preceding expansion. The mechanism was different. The directional logic, losses move downward, profits stay concentrated, was identical. The people who made the decisions that created the 2008 crisis absorbed, in aggregate, a remarkably small share of the consequences. The people who lost homes, jobs, retirement savings absorbed the overwhelming majority. The castle held. The people in the villages around it paid. The medieval noble family that borrowed to bridge a bad harvest found themselves unable to repay when war redirected their revenue and passed the accumulated obligation to the next generation. That family's financial situation was structurally identical to the situation of a young person entering the contemporary labor market carrying student loan debt incurred to purchase the credential required to access the jobs that service the economy. The debt was taken on at a moment of constrained choice. The terms of the debt reflected the power asymmetry between the borrower who needed the money and the lender who had it. The ongoing obligation consumed income that might otherwise have compounded into asset accumulation. The next generation inherited not the castle, but the debt attached to it. The contemporary version of that sentence does not require translation. None of this means that the medieval castle and the modern corporation are identical. They are not. The differences matter, but the differences should not obscure the continuities. We were told to see the castle as a symbol of order, protection, and civilizational achievement. The ledgers told a different story, one of fixed costs and variable income, of debt spirals and downward transfers, of information asymmetries exploited by the financially sophisticated at the expense of the financially vulnerable, of individual decisions by specific actors producing systemic consequences absorbed by people who had no voice in those decisions. We are told, with comparable consistency, to see the contemporary financial system as a neutral, efficient mechanism for allocating capital to its most productive uses. The ledgers of the contemporary system tell a different story, one that looks, in its structural logic, remarkably familiar. The walls are taller now, the stone is metaphorical, the chain across the river is algorithmic, the Harriet is called something else, the direction the money moves is the same. Read the ledgers. Not the legend, the ledger. When an institution tells you a story about itself that emphasizes its role as protector, provider, guarantor of order and stability, ask what the accounts show. Who is paying the fixed costs? Who is absorbing the variable risk? When the income falls short, who bears the gap? When the debt accumulates, in which direction does it move? The castle owners of medieval Europe were not uniquely evil. Many of them were competent, even conscientious administrators of complex institutions operating under genuine constraints. But the system they operated within, the system they maintained, perpetuated, and in many cases deliberately defended against reform, was structured to produce outcomes that concentrated benefit and distributed cost. That structure did not require malice to function. It required only that the people within it continue to make the individually rational decisions that the incentives pointed toward. Individually rational decisions. Collectively extractive outcomes. The pattern runs from Caernarfon in 1283 to Wall Street in 2008 to wherever you are sitting right now, trying to figure out why the arithmetic of your own financial life seems so persistently, inexplicably tilted. It's not inexplicable, it's structural. And structures can be understood, named, and, when enough people understand them clearly enough, changed. That is the lesson the ledgers have been waiting to teach for 700 years. The question is whether we are finally ready to read them. Comment below. Do you think Edward III knew exactly what he was doing when he borrowed 1.5 million florins from the Bardi and Peruzzi, deliberately offloading military risk onto private creditors he had no intention of repaying? Or was he simply a product of a system that left him no other options? Type calculated or trapped in the comments. Send this video to one person who still believes that concentrated wealth naturally trickles downward to the people who produce it. The medieval ledgers answered that question 700 years ago. The answer hasn't changed, but most people have never been shown the actual numbers. Next week, I'll be showing you an internal document from the English Exchequer, dated 1341, a memorandum that shows Royal Treasury officials had calculated, in precise detail, exactly how much of Edward III's war debt could never realistically be repaid, and what the consequences for the Florentine banking houses would be. They knew. They wrote it down, and then the loans continued anyway. That document exists. The implications of what it contains have never been fully explored in a public forum. We'll do that next week.